Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your lovely lunch. I think I might have to make a request for lighter lunches because we all need you to be awake for the next section. So maybe we'll get to do some jumping jacks, Mary suggested, before her presentation to make sure that we're all focused. Because this session is really important. It's about Ireland's biodiversity obligations and governance. So in ways that Laura Burke from the EPA spoke to us about the climate change policies and obligations, we're now going to take a look at what's currently there for biodiversity. So it'll set the context for the management of Ireland's biodiversity. It's incredibly important, as I said, and I'm very glad that we have the two speakers who will guide us through this kind of labyrinth of policies and laws. The small amount that I've seen, it seems to be very complex, and no wonder they've asked a Citizens' Assembly to try and find some sense and some coherence in it. So I'm very delighted to welcome Dr Micheál O'Briain, who is a recently retired official from the European Commission, where he spent almost 30 years working on EU nature and biodiversity policy and legislation. He's going to speak on Ireland's EU and other international obligations, while also bringing his experience and his insight into the presentation. Now, and to remind us as well that he's not speaking on the behalf of the EU or its institutions. He's coming now in his personal capacity as a retiree who travelled all the way up from lovely Achill in County Mayo to be with us. So please join me in welcoming Dr Micheál O'Briain.
Gordon Mahagut, Even, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you here today. I've got the exciting after dinner slot, so I hope you don't get indigestion from hearing me. But anyway, I've been asked to say a few words about the international context, the EU context for biodiversity conservation. So let's get into it. Thinking about ancestors, Homo sapiens has been on the planet for 200,000 years or more. And I was just thinking that our debate, the international debate and action on biodiversity, really has only been happening in the last few decades. I would say that 1962, that publication by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, captured the essence of this debate in terms of the fact that we were now facing global problems. In this case, it was the use of chemical pesticides for agriculture that was not only destroying nature, hence the silent spring of birdsong, but also that it was actually causing risks to human health and our place on the planet. That triggered an environmental movement which in 1972, heads of state and government came together in Stockholm for the first Earth Summit, where they really debated and started to talk about the need for action to address this global problem. Later that year, heads of state and government of the European Union, what's now the European Union, came together in Paris, and they actually took a decision that the environment was going to be part of the EU agenda, and that led to programs of work that now continue to the present day. But as Liam has said, the watershed moment was in 1992 at the second Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where there was a critical set of decisions taken not only on climate change, on desertification, on sustainable development, but a commitment through a new convention on biodiversity. That's the overarching global framework in relation to biodiversity conservation. There are 196 contracting parties. The EU is a contracting party, as are all the member states, including Ireland. And it has three main objectives. I mean, Taz gave you an excellent introduction to what biodiversity is, but this convention looks at the conservation of biodiversity in all its components. It looks at the issue of sustainable use, because many communities, and we've had a lovely lunch on biodiversity, many communities depend upon use, and that has to be sustainable. And when this convention was being debated, it was also critical that the poorer, biodiverse, rich countries had access to the benefits that were accruing from using genetic resources, that there would be fair and equitable sharing. As Liam has explained, The Convention operates through strategic plans setting targets for each 10-year period. The current plan is being updated, and there's going to be a big conference in Montreal at the end of this year where hopefully an ambitious agenda for 2030. It was delayed by COVID, but hopefully an ambitious agenda will be set for 2030. The EU has already set out a biodiversity strategy for this decade, which is very ambitious. And the EU tries to work, the countries work together in a unified voice in this global perspective to try and ensure we get an ambitious outcome for this global agenda. And Ireland, as we know, is working on updating its 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan. So that's the framework in which we are trying to act. There are, of course, a whole series of other international conventions that you should be aware of. I don't have time to go into any of them, but just to mention that we have a convention on the conservation and wise use of wetlands from Ramsar. We have a CITES convention which deals in trade in endangered species. That is a major driver. Illegal trade is a major driver for the loss of some critically endangered species. We have a convention on migratory species called the Bond Convention, which tries to generate cooperation between countries throughout the flyways of birds and other species that migrate between different countries. We have a Council of Europe Convention on European Wildlife, which complements what we're doing in the EU. It has a broader European perspective, and it's important that we cooperate. And then, particularly for a country like Ireland, which has a huge maritime area, the marine environment and the Convention for the Protection for the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic is highly relevant. But I would argue that the main driver for action by Ireland and other countries in the EU has been the laws that have been passed and agreed unanimously by Ireland and other countries to protect biodiversity and environment more generally. And if I could just briefly introduce them to you, we have a directive from 1979 which sets out to conserve all wild bird species in the European Union, a shared heritage of all the different countries. That was broadened in 1992 into a habitats directive. It's about fauna and flora, and also habitats for the first time that are considered to be of EU conservation concern based on their endangerment. And that gave birth to what we call the Natura 2000 network of protected areas. And I'm just curious to know, how many people in this room had heard about Natura 2000 before you signed up to this process? Could I have a show of hands? How many of you had heard of Natura 2000, which is probably the most significant European undertaking for biodiversity in the last 30 years? That will tell us that we need to know more about what's going on in terms of the biodiversity commitments and agenda. It's not surprising you're a representative of what we have seen from Eurobarometers. We have a directive on zoos, that zoos in the 21st century should be promoting conservation programs. We have one on invasive species. Taz mentioned that this is one of the key drivers. So we have a directive or a regulation that sets out lists of species that action needs to be taken to either eradicate them, contain them, or prevent them from turning up in the first place. And it's worth mentioning that we have a new nature restoration law that has been proposed in the past months, which is now being negotiated with the European Parliament and the Member States. And that is really strategically important for the agenda as we move forward in the years ahead. And there are a whole series of other pieces of EU environmental legislation on water quality, on the marine environment, including marine protected areas, on how to deal with plans and projects, big developments, to ensure that environmental assessment takes place, the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive and the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. And there's even a directive called Environmental Liability, which means that the polluter should pay, that if some organization causes serious damage to biodiversity, they should be held liable for this. Now, so we do have a good body of legislation, but the core of it, I would argue, is what we call the nature directives, the birds and the habitats directives. And they set out, looking at the species that are vulnerable, the habitats, to restore them and maintain them in what we would describe as a healthy state. There are 4 pillars to that legislation that countries have signed up to, and that is, firstly, ensuring space for nature. Critical to any debate on biodiversity is having good protected areas that are well managed and that deliver benefits for biodiversity and people. But that's only going to be, we'd say, 1/5 or 1/3 of the landscape, so you need measures that take place in the wider sea and landscape as well. Some species need particular focus for action, so there are strict species protection requirements for many species of European conservation concern, and even those that can be used, like in the case of hunting, there needs to be good rules to ensure that these practices are sustainable and not damaging to conservation. And of course, if you don't measure and monitor and report, you're not able to assess progress. So what Liam had shown you in terms of the knowledge, the data requirements, they are fundamental to assessing progress. Now, I didn't come here today to name and shame, but I think it's important to draw from our experience over the last 30 years. And unfortunately, when it comes to the EU legislation, Ireland doesn't have a great track record. There have been difficulties, delays in implementation. The EU Court of Justice in Luxembourg ultimately interprets and decides whether a country is complying with the laws or not. And unfortunately, there have been a whole series of biodiversity-related cases that have gone to the court, and Ireland has been condemned for its failures to establish the protected areas, for its failures to protect the sites, for its failures to actually deal with some serious problems like overgrazing in the uplands in the west, for its failures on species protection rules. There's even a case at the moment in the court, which will probably be decided next year, in relation to the designation and putting in place the conservation measures. Because it's no use saying it's a protected area and it's a paper park. You have to have measures that actually deliver the conservation on the ground, working with the people that live in and around those areas. So that's fundamental in this debate. There are issues in relation to peatland conservation. That's been probably the most difficult issue in relation to Ireland's implementation of the Habitats Directive. The raised bogs in the Midland, we only have a remnant of raised bogs that are worth conserving under the Habitats Directive. But yet, of the 55 that are protected under the Habitats Directive, today there is still illegal cutting and destruction of raised bogs taking place. And you ask, despite all the progress, and there has been progress on conservation, why this is still happening. And Ireland boasts 9 times its marine area of land, and yet it has one of the poorest records on marine protected areas, 2.4% versus an EU-wide average of 9%. The Taoiseach says 30% marine protected areas by 2030. Well, that's a big job of work that has to be done, and it won't happen by accident. Now, rather than being negative, let's just ask a few questions. What are the fundamental drivers of success? We looked at, based on reporting from member states, where we're getting improvements in conservation of species and habitats. And the fundamentals to it are political support. This has to be on the political agenda. You need strong and coherent governance. We will talk about that. Hopefully, Mary will give you some valuable insights into that. And you need institutions across all of the decision-making bodies that have the capacity to do the job and with motivated staff. And I have huge respect for colleagues in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, but they were not given the resources to do the job, the human resources, the financial resources. They were not given the political support. So that's why we're in this position today. You need adequate and effective consultation and engagement, because we're talking to a large extent about private land. There's national parks, nature reserves, but a lot of it is private land. So you need to talk and work with people and find solutions that deliver co-benefits for nature and for people. You need research and monitoring, because to design the right measures, you need to understand the ecological requirements of the species. Taz gave an excellent example about the natterjack toad. Unless you understand what needs to be done through research and monitoring, you're not going to put in place the right measures. You're going to waste taxpayers' money. And, I always believe that conservation without money is simply conversation. So unless you have access to funding proper funding, and a lot of it is public funding. We can get private funding as well, but this is a public good. There are programs under the EU budgets, like the LIFE program, and there's some really good examples. I hope Andy tomorrow, Andy Bleasday, will say something about that in terms of really good strategic projects on bogs, on Macaire, on Corncrake that are now taking shape. But they need to be supported by bigger funds, and the biggest one of all is the agricultural budget in Ireland. So if that isn't working for nature, we're in trouble. And of course, it's not a quick fix. The long-term sustainability, if you make an investment, you need to sustain it over time. The Burren project has shown that, where initially it was a life project, but it has been sustained through the commitment of investment and the local community. My final comments are by way of just adding to your reflection. Several people have reminded us that in the context of biodiversity, we're dealing with seriously depleted nature. So it's not enough to say we need to keep what we've got. We've lost so much that we need to be talking about a serious program of restoration through the years ahead. And that's why this new law on restoration, and this is the United Nations Decade of Restoration, that needs to be taken seriously. It doesn't happen by accident. You need to have not only these targets. Somebody asked a really good question. Why aren't we reaching our targets? Because we haven't worked out the mechanisms to deliver them and get the commitments through human financial engagement to do so. So that needs to be done. So if we have a 30% target for protected areas, the most special places for nature, that needs to have a program of work that does deliver it. And honestly, it's no use having laws. You have to work with people, you have to promote compliance, but ultimately you have to ensure compliance. There needs to be enforcement. If somebody's driving their car drunk home every night, unless there's a proper enforcement mechanism, everybody sees that the law doesn't make any sense. And finally, my final point of reflection is, we have good legislation. If it's fully implemented, we are well on the road to recovery. But solving the biodiversity crisis really has to be broadened into the wider sustainable development goals. We heard from Laura in relation to climate. There's so many win-wins on climate and biodiversity. The whole food system. Let's change the agriculture debate to one about the quality of food and how it's produced from farm to fork, and how we can make sure that farmers benefit and society benefits. And ultimately, how we consume and produce. Because biodiversity conservation is ultimately about the way we live. Thank you.